Hi, I'm Shauna Bolingbrook. This is my very messy studio space. It's great. I just wanted to really briefly go over the key differences and similarities between watercolor, gouache, and acrylic paint. So as you can see here, I have my watercolors in this nice little tray. You can buy them in the tube, or you can buy them in a palette like this. In the tube, it'll still be like that wet paint texture. In the palette, it's that same paint, but it's been dried out. Watercolor is really awesome that way. It reactivates beautifully. All you have to do is add a little more water to it, and it's exactly the same as it was before. Gouache paint, also I have it in the tube. It reactivates as well if you let it dry. I have a little bit on my palette here from an old painting I can show you. It's not quite as vibrant when you reactivate it, I found, so I like to use it right out of the tube. And then of course we have acrylic paint, which you can get it in a tube also, but I like to just buy the wood paint ones because they have so many fun colors that you can choose from at the craft store. And yeah, this one does not reactivate once it's dried. Once it's dried, it's there for good. So if don't be wearing a shirt you like. I actually think I might run and put an apron on before I demonstrate the rest of this, because this stuff is killer for your wardrobe. Okay, awesome. So I've already done a swatch of my watercolor here. I'll do another one. For watercolors, you're just going to wet down your brush, dip it into the dry paint, and you do your little swatch of color right there. So a few things I love about watercolors: they're super transparent. So you can see the white of my paper through here. If you layer another color on top of it, you will see the color beneath shining through. I mean, it's like layering glass or looking through a stained glass window. I mean, if they interact really fun that way. Let me go ahead and I'll get some gouache out here. So I have a little bit of leftover red gouache dried here. So I'll just show you kind of what it looks like when you try to bring it back to life. So it looks a lot like my watercolor. It's looking pretty transparent, but if I go straight out of the tube, it's actually a little bit more opaque. I'm just gonna wet this down a little bit. Okay, so really vibrant, bright, and you get more of your pastel type. You can get bright with watercolor, but on their own, they tend to be really pastel if you don't do a ton of layering. Gouache is a little bit more vibrant, more pigmented. It does have a little bit of that transparent effect if you add more water, but not nearly as much as watercolor. And then we have acrylic paint. I actually have a different tray I like to use for my acrylics. And as you can see, it's there for good. So I've had this thing for, I don't know, maybe a year, and this is all of the dried up acrylic paint that I've used. So this is that color we're going to use. As you can see, like if I wet down my brush and I really paint at it, it's not going anywhere. Maybe, I think that's even left over from my gouache that just came through there. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of this. Okay, got it right there, and we'll just paint a little bit right there. Okay, so watercolor, gouache, acrylic. I'm going to actually paint over my writing here just a tiny bit so you can see more so the transparent properties. I'll just do a dot on each of these. You can see like how much or how little each one shows through. Okay, so pretty fun. So you can still see like the black pen through it, but if I were to layer it and layer it, eventually it would completely vanish with the acrylic paint for sure. So just a few things about these guys. They are all similar in the fact that they're paint. They're all red. but their key differences come from what happens after you put them on the paper. So as you can see, watercolor is transparent. These two you cannot see through. The layering effects will be very different. Another thing is about like how permanent they are. So watercolor and gouache are very flexible. So once you have it on the paper, I can just go in and add some water. And I can re-wet the paint and blend it together and pull it out. That's just by adding water. And if I can do the same thing with my gouache guy over here. If I do that with the acrylic, that won't work the same way. Unless you work really quickly when it's still wet. It might still be wet enough for me to... Okay, so as you can see, like it pulled out a tiny bit, but look at like this fuzzy line versus that sharp contrast there. So those are your key differences. I kind of like to think of gouache as if watercolor and acrylic paint had a baby, because it took the flexibility from mom, but then it took the bright vibrance from dad, or however you want to look at that. So I made this little chart. I just wanted to show you some of the cool effects you can get with the watercolor. So watercolor, gouache, and acrylic paint. So in this first column here, I will be using more paint and less water just to show how it affects it. Equal amounts of paint and water, less paint and more water. And then I'll also show you kind of the painting two wet colors together, what happens, and then waiting for one to dry before putting another color on top of it. You'll see kind of what I'm talking about once I actually show it to you. So first things first, more paint. Let's look at what happens as I add more water. So I'm going to I'm scooping some paint out of my tray here and putting it in this little plate up there. And I'm adding just some water to it. So it's about 50-50, half water, half paint. And look at how light that becomes. So I'm actually going to add another color here just so you can kind of see how the paint mixes together. So I'm going to introduce some blues. All right, so let's go ahead and test out with our watercolor first. So a rule I like to remind my students is a wet will always blend with wet, but it won't blend with dry. So we're going to do our wet layer first. Okay, and I'm just wetting this down here. Just kind of to demonstrate. I actually want a smaller brush here. I'm just gonna wet down the top triangle in this square here. So I'm just painting straight water onto it. And I'm going to paint the stripe of blue. And look how it's just bleeding, like that puddle of water I left on there, it's spreading rapidly. And I'll do a stripe of red next to it. And look how they just like bleed and blend into each other. So wet will always mix with wet. So on this half of the page, I have it dry still. So we'll just do a stripe of red here. We'll do a stripe of blue here. And look at how crisp those lines are when it's dry. So I'm going to let those dry completely, and then I'll show you what happens when you layer. Let's see how dry these guys are. This is almost there. Maybe I'll go back to these guys here, and I'll just demonstrate kind of what happens when you layer. So I'm going to layer some blue watercolor over the top of my red here, so you can just see what happens when you layer transparent versus opaque. So I'm just going to do a little stripe there. So if you look really closely, again, we can kind of see through this one, but it's a lot harder to see through these two. So that is what I have for you. I'll just hold this up so you can see a little better. I'll have a picture saved on my Instagram so you can come and look back. But just a brief review. They're all similar in the fact that they're paint, but watercolor is transparent and flexible. Gouache is opaque and flexible, and acrylic is opaque and permanent. If you ever have any questions about this, feel free to message me on Instagram or Facebook, or shoot me an email at shauna.rb.art@gmail.com. And hopefully I will see you in one of my classes soon. Bye.